belonging. The plural or diverse population to which she refers is one that she understood Eichmann to deny, to destroy. And so also do all forms of the nation state, in her view, that seek to maintain a homogeneous national character. It became important for Arendt to argue after the Second World War that political life must be understood as always plural, multilingual. Reading her now, we have to ask how this plurality might still be affirmed under conditions where borders establish intractable and antagonistic forms of adjacency, or when global distances, both geographical and cultural, make the affirmation of ties more difficult. In my view, Arendt's normative views still hold. There is no one part of the population that can claim the earth for itself. No community or nation state or regional unit, no clan, no party, no race. And as I've suggested, to make such a claim that one group does own the earth is to enter into a policy of genocide. This means that unwilled proximity and unchosen cohabitation are preconditions of political life, the basis of her critique of nationalism, and they imply the obligation to live on the earth and in a polity that establishes modes of equality for a necessarily and irreversibly heterogeneous population. Indeed, unwilled proximity and unchosen cohabitation serve as the basis of our obligations not to destroy any part of the human population and to outlaw genocide as a crime against humanity, but also to invest institutions with the ethical demand to make all lives equally livable. Thus, from unchosen cohabitation, Arendt derives notions of universality and equality that commit us to institutions that seek to sustain human lives without regarding some part of the population as, in principle, unsustainable, socially dead, redundant, or intrinsically unworthy of life and protection, and therefore ungrievable. Of course, Arendt's views on the state of Israel were scandalous at the time, but actually it seems to me that the very notion of plurality that she articulated against Eichmann was one that she proposed for a federated government in Palestine, Israel at the time. What is evident is that her views on cohabitation, federated authority, equality, and universality were in stark contrast to those who were defending nationalist forms of Jewish sovereignty, differential classifications for Jewish and non-Jewish citizens of the State of Israel, military policies to uproot Palestinians from their lands, and efforts to establish a Jewish demographic majority for the State of Israel. Although it's so often taught that Israel became an historical and ethical necessity for the Jews during and after the Nazi genocide, and that anyone who questions the founding principles of the Jewish state shows an extraordinary insensitivity to the plight of the Jews, it's important to remember that there were Jewish thinkers and political activists at the time, including Arendt, Martin Buber, Hans Kohn, and Judah Magnus, who thought that among the most important lessons of the Holocaust was an opposition to illegitimate state violence and to any state formation that sought to give electoral priority and citizenship to one race or religion, and that nation states ought to be internationally barred from dispossessing whole populations who fail to fit the purified idea of the nation. For some Jewish refugees who never again wished to see the dispossession of populations in the name of national or religious purity, Zionism and its forms of military violence against indigenous Palestinian populations were not the legitimate answer to the pressing needs of Jewish refugees. In the Eichmann text, Arendt continues to have the stateless in mind, as she did when she considered the massive deportations from Europe in World War II, and when in 1948 she objected to Ben-Gurion's proposals for Jewish national sovereignty. In 1944 and in 1948, she predicted a new refugee problem, not merely one that would happen during the Nakba of 1948 to over 750,000 Palestinians, but one that would continue to happen as the State of Israel moved forward as a nation state on the model that she rejected and thought everyone should reject as well. She could not have predicted the 1.4 million who now have that refugee status within the West Bank and Gaza alone, not even including those who are in exile, but she did predict that nation states that seek to regulate the racial or religious composition of their populations invariably produce new classes of refugees, and they call into question their own legitimacy by expelling populations who do not conform to the national norm. Her call for cohabitation was meant quite clearly to counter not only the genocidal politics of National Socialism, but the recurrent production of the stateless by any and all nations that seek to purge themselves of heterogeneity. And though she would have never argued that Israel is like Nazi Germany, and she would have rejected the analogy, and I propose that we all reject the analogy, she was clear that Israel was continuing a project of settler colonialism in the name of a national liberation project, producing hundreds of thousands of refugees that would not only delegitimate any claims to democracy made by that state, but it would keep that state embroiled in conflict for decades to come. 1944, in conflict for decades to come. For those who extrapolated principles of justice from the historical experience of internment and dispossession, the political aim was to extend equality regardless of cultural background or formation across languages and religions to those none of us ever chose or did not recognize that we had chosen, and with whom we have an enduring obligation to find a way to live. For whoever we are also those who were never chosen, who emerge on this earth without everyone's consent, and who belong from the start to a wider population and a sustainable earth. And this condition, paradoxically, yields the radical potential for new modes of sociality and politics beyond the avid and wretched bonds formed through settler colonialism and expulsion. We are all, in this sense, the unchosen people, but we are nevertheless unchosen together. It's not uninteresting to note that Arendt, herself a Jew and a refugee, understood her obligation not to belong to the chosen people, but rather to the unchosen, and to make mixed community precisely among those whose existence implies a right to exist and to lead a livable life. So I've offered you two perspectives derived in different ways from what we might call Jewishness. Levinas was himself a self-avowed Jewish thinker and Zionist, deriving his account of responsibility from an understanding of the commandments, how they act upon us, how they compel us to act ethically. And Arendt, though surely not religious in any conventional sense, nevertheless took her position as a Jewish refugee from the Second World War as a point of departure for thinking about genocide and statelessness, and for the plural conditions of political life. Of course, neither of them are easy to work with in a struggle such as mine. As with Levinas, there are parts of Arendt's position that are clearly racist. She objected, for instance, to Arab Jews, identified as a European, and thought others should as well. And yet some of what she writes is still a resource for thinking about the current global obligations to oppose and resist genocide, the reproduction of stateless populations, and the importance of struggling for a plural and open-ended conception of social and political life. Arendt's Euro-American framework was limited, yet another limitation comes to mind if we try to understand the relationship of precarity to practices of cohabitation. I want to suggest that precarity only makes sense if we're able to identify as clearly political issues bodily dependency and need, hunger, and the need for shelter, vulnerability to injury and destruction, forms of social trust that let us live and thrive, I would say embodied forms of social trust, and the passions that are linked to our very persistence. If Arendt thought that such matters had to be relegated to the private realm, Levinas understood the importance of vulnerability to ethics, although he failed really to link vulnerability to a politics of the body. Although Levinas seems to presuppose a body impinged upon, he doesn't give it an explicit place in his ethical philosophy. And though Arendt theorizes the problem of the body, of the located body, the speaking body that emerges into the space of appearance as part of any account of political action, she's not quite willing to affirm a politics that struggles to overcome inequalities in food distribution, that affirms rights of housing, which targets inequalities in the sphere of reproductive labor. In my view, ethical claims emerge from bodily life itself, a bodily life that is not always unambiguously human. After all, the life that is worth preserving and safeguarding, the life that should be protected from murder, in Levinas's sense, or genocide in Arendt's sense, is connected to and dependent upon non-human life in essential ways. This follows from the idea of the human animal, and it's a different point of departure for thinking about politics. If we try to understand in concrete terms what it means to commit ourselves to preserving the life of the other, we are invariably confronted with the bodily conditions of life, and so a commitment not only to the other's corporeal persistence, but to all the environmental conditions that make corporeal persistence possible. In the so-called private sphere delineated in Arendt's The Human Condition, we find the question of needs, the reproduction of the material conditions of life, the problem of transience, of death itself, everything that pertains to precarious life. We find it all, but we find it in the private domain, not the public domain. The possibility of whole populations being annihilated either through genocidal policies or systemic negligence follows not only from the fact that there are those who believe they can decide among whom they will inhabit the earth, but also because such thinking presupposes a disavowal of an irreducible fact of politics, the vulnerability to destruction by others that follows from a condition of precarity in all modes of political and social interdependency. So even if we were to take Arendt seriously, that we must oppose genocide, we must understand that what makes us vulnerable to genocide is the fact that we are living beings who are vulnerable to destruction by others. We can make this into an existential claim, oh, everyone is precarious, and this follows from our social existence as bodily beings who depend upon one another for shelter and sustenance, and who are therefore at risk of homelessness, hunger, statelessness, destitution under unjust and unequal political conditions. And I am making that claim, but what I want to say is that I'm also making a slightly different claim, which is that our precarity is to a large extent dependent upon the organization of economic and social relationships, the presence or absence of sustaining infrastructures and social and political institutions. In this sense, precarity is indissociable from that dimension of politics that addresses the organization and protection of bodily needs. Precarity exposes our sociality, the fragile and necessary dimensions of our interdependency. And in this sense, it is from precarity that certain ethical obligations emerge. Whether explicitly stated or not, every political effort to manage populations involves a tactical distribution of precarity, more often than not articulated through an unequal distribution of precarity, one that depends on dominant norms regarding whose life is grievable, worth protecting, whose life is ungrievable, or marginally or episodically grievable, and so in that sense already lost in part or in whole, and thus less worthy of protection and sustenance. A different social ontology would have to start from a shared condition of precarity in order to refute those normative operations, pervasively racist, that decide in advance who counts as human and who does not, who has a right to cohabit the earth, who does not. My point is not so much to rehabilitate humanism, but rather to struggle for a conception of ethical obligation that is grounded in precarity. No one escapes the precarious feature of social life, and we cannot understand cohabitation without understanding that a generalized precarity obligates us to oppose genocide and to sustain life on egalitarian terms. Perhaps this feature of our lives can serve as the basis for the rights of protection against genocide, whether through deliberate or negligent means. After all, even though our interdependency constitutes us as more than thinking beings, even as more than acting beings, indeed as social, as embodied, as vulnerable and passionate, our thinking gets nowhere